Good afternoon, and welcome to this gathering to celebrate 25 years of the most important award here at the GST, the Druker Traveling Fellowship. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rahul Mehrotra. I chair the Urban Planning and Design Department. I'm also an alum. I graduated in 1987, the year the first fellowship was awarded. The Druker Traveling Fellowship was established in 1986 by Ronald Druker, who was a Loeb Fellow in 76, and by the trustees of the Bertram Druker Charitable Foundation. And we are delighted that Ron is here with us today and has supported this event. The fellowship is open to all students at the GST who demonstrate excellence in the design of urban environments. The fellowship offers students the opportunity to travel in the United States or abroad to pursue studies that advance an understanding of urban design. And that's really the intent and mission of the fellowship. It's awarded annually, and it enables comprehensive research-based travel throughout the world. As in the terms of the award, the fellowship is made with the intention of creating urban environments that are practical and imaginative responses to the broad spectrum of physical, political, financial, and the aesthetic concerns of society. And the award really deepens the experience of the recipient in terms of design education and expects them to make an important contribution to the global discourse in design-based research. And the awardees are leaders in the design of urban environments, and they're expected to share their experiences with the GST community through a lecture or symposium on completion of their travel. And it was really at one of these symposiums 2 years ago when I just sort of joined the GST, and Felipe, who usually hosts the event, wasn't there, and I was hosting it, and I met Ron for the first time, and realized that one of my classmates was the first recipient, and that it was 25 years that over lunch, Ron and I decided that we must celebrate the evolution of the award in this 25th year, and I'm so happy that we've managed to sort of do this. And for me, it's of course personally a special occasion because the first recipient was Bill McElroy, a close friend, a classmate, and he's here with us today, and we're going to hear soon from him. For the GST to have had a member of its family, an individual like Ron Druker, who was also a member of the faculty here from 78 to 83, in addition to being a Loeb Fellow in 76, and who's had the foresight to understand the world was changing, and the generosity to create this very special endowed fellowship, I think, has been a great boon to us. Ron obviously realized that education in the classroom had to be complemented with on-site experiences of travel, and this has been a real contribution, I believe, to the texture of education here at the GST. The fellowship is a fantastic format, a sort of complementary learning sort of process, because it allows for expansive research at a global scale through the travel project, allowing for a comparative research across nations and continents, as you will see from some of the presentations later today. In effect, what the fellowship has done is create ambassadors or probes, perhaps, in that sense, who go out into the changing world and return here to the GST to report back on the samples they've discerned. This feedback loop, I believe, is critical, and we are, with Ron now, exploring ways of how this format can be tweaked so that we can, evolve a format and construct a mechanism by which this feedback can be made more productive by creating an archive and documentation, and will become a depository of learning for us here at the GST. And I think that's the responsibility I feel we are charged with at the GST. We're grateful to have such an endowment because I think we're going to explore ways we can capture these experiences so that we can share it more broadly with a larger community of emerging scholars and urban designers, both here at the GST and outside it. In fact, the Druker Travel Fellowship is the first international one focused on travel, dedicated to promote urban design. This is naturally important in today's urban world where cities are growing at an alarming rate. Mapping, analyzing cities, or often just their large fragments, as you'll see in some of the projects, has become a critical activity for learning and research. In fact, the legacy of the fellowship that we're hoping to construct the GST is its contribution as an important archive of urban design for the school and the profession more generally. Urban design, being viewed more as a practice than a discipline, it becomes even more critical because it relies on instruments such as this to build its research base and theoretical base. And it's important for us as a resource, more strategically, to build on this. And I think we really see this collectively as the natural evolution of the fellowship and its format. And it's with this view that this year we've also initiated the idea of the exhibition, which we will move to after this event and have a reception there. It captures the current research. It's curated by Carlos Alfaro, who is a 2012 recipient of the fellowship, and Felipe Correa has worked with him to curate the exhibition. It's titled Form and Pedagogy, an Atlas of 20th Century University Cities in Latin America. It's really an interesting and wonderful piece of work, and we're hoping that we can also catalog these more systematically in the future. In 1986, when the fellowship was founded, the notion of a globalized world was still emerging. Travel was not easy. Many parts of Asia were not even so accessible. India, China, Korea, Taiwan, which we all engage with so easily now, were all waking from their slumber. So the travels of our first few recipients, who will be on the first panel, was about discovery in the true sense. Itineraries were broad. There were no internet or cell phones that would comfort them on their journeys. In fact, the library was perhaps the only source of their research till they hit the ground. And there's been an amazing shift just in this last decade and a half. And you'll hear this afternoon from several of the Druker Fellows, and each one will acknowledge the transformative nature of the fellowship and how it provided this sort of format which transformed the way that they thought about the world. I hope we will also hear from the fellows about the relevance of the fellowship at graduation and the formative aspects or impact that it has had in shaping their careers. What will become evident, I believe, in these presentations, the broad spectrum in terms of scope and the ambition of each traveling fellowship. And I think there are many other fellows. Could I ask for a show of hands of the other fellows who are attending? And Guy. So yeah, there are a number of you here. And it'd be great if you also sort of contributed to the discussion through these panel discussions. Ron, we are really deeply honored to celebrate the 25th anniversary of your generosity, your investment in the training of our design students, and your belief that creating an opportunity for further study and experience can extend the research of urban design is deeply applauded. Your commitment to our students at this early stage of their urban design careers brings depth to the education at the GSD and to our Department of Urban Planning and Design. The GSD is fortunate to have you as one of our long-standing benefactors. Thank you very much for this. And before we move on to our presentations, I'm going to invite Ron to say a few words and to welcome the symposium guests. Thank you, Ron.
Well, thanks. You know, you got to look at this book and see who all of these people have become since they were at the GSD. And in the early days, I actually sat in the selection committee. I was a little bit of a rubber stamp, but I would read the proposals and sit with Professor Krieger, a former student, I might add, and others, and decide. And I really didn't, but they said, okay, yeah, sure, it's okay. And I used to come to the graduation and sit in the audience and watch the recipient and then meet with him or her. And then somehow, because it started with Bill, that we'd go to a small restaurant, which has since closed, and have sushi. Don't ask me why, but it just started that way. And obviously, it's grown. And thank you, Harvard Management, because it's quite a stipend today. And the combination of jet travel, the internet, and Harvard Management makes it a pretty good gig, I would think. And for me, as I say, and some of you have heard this, when we have the annual presentation and luncheon, I say, you know, you have to understand how it makes me feel to be alive and enjoy the fruits of our family's philanthropy. Because people can leave something from their estate, and it's great, and maybe their heirs will get some enjoyment from it. But, excuse me, I mean, I see Guy, and I know Bill #1, and he'll always be #1. But I see all of the rest of you who have come, and it's a pleasure for me. I always benefited from travel. And J.J. Bell, who's sitting here, who was with the Druker Company for 25 years and involved in many of the projects which we did over that. I mean, it was everything that we did over that time period. I would come back from traveling, and I can tell you that the doorbell, the night doorbell at the Heritage, came from London, and that a detail on the corner of the Heritage came from a building in Paris. And there are others, whether it's signage or whether it's floor material. I mean, I'm the only guy who goes into the Louvre and I'm taking pictures of the floor, the Sistine Chapel, and I'm taking pictures of the floor. And the guard is saying no, and I'm figuring he's saying no because I should be focused on the ceiling and not the floor, and I don't quite understand it. But this all came about because of, first of all, Ted Monticelli, the late Ted Monticelli, who was my teaching partner, who I met at a cocktail party in Newton probably in 1974, I know it was 74, encouraged me to apply for the Loeb Fellowship. And I applied for the fellowship, and the rest is history, as they say. But it'll be 38 years this April that I've been associated with the school. And I've been on the visiting committee, and I'm chairman of the strategic planning committee today, and been involved, obviously, in this program. And this is a great school, and it's going to get greater. But what the fellows have done is proof of how good the school is and how good each of them has been since they left here. And it makes me feel good that they benefited from what we're lucky enough to be able to do. You know, I used to go to urban design conferences. And I don't know, Raul, if even today urban design has defined itself. But I used to leave those conferences because it was really in its infancy. It was in the late 70s, really. And there was a woman who sort of, there was an urban design magazine, and I forget the woman's name. I'm not sure that she's still alive. But she spawned this. And the whole symposium was about the definition of what urban design means. And it's fuzzy. But it's certainly, I've been a beneficiary of being at this school, and what I have learned from the students and the faculty has stood me well. So this should be great. I'm really looking forward to it. And also, I want to thank Beth. I want to thank the dean, Felipe, Carlos, Raul. Thank you so much. I remember when we had that lunch and we talked about this. And it's not easy to put together something like this. And when you look also at this booklet, you'll see that all the fellows were contacted. And it's a pretty impressive group of people. And it really makes me feel good that I played some role in their personal success. So let the games begin. Thank you.
So yeah, let the games begin. And so this afternoon session, we've organized this as 2 sessions. The first panel, we sort of selected or curated it such that we'd have 3 presentations from recipients of fellowships from 1987, the first one, to 2002, a sort of slice of the first decade and a half of the fellowship. And the intent here is to capture the concerns and experiences of that first generation of fellows. And then the second panel are the 3 most recent recipients, which sort of show you what are the contemporary concerns. So in fact, yesterday, reflecting the first generation of fellows, yesterday Doug, who handles our AV stuff and has been for decades, actually pulled out a slide projector and oiled it and changed bulbs, and because Bill McElroy requested slide projection. And so he's going to really take us back. So for some of you who've never seen slide projections, this is going to be a treat. But it also is a wonderful way of representing that moment when he actually traveled. And of course, the second panel is the more contemporary, the last 3 years, which will have its own flavor. So we're going to start with Bill. And Bill was awarded this fellowship in 1987. He studied the astounding growth and change on the periphery of 3 cities, Tokyo, Kolkata, it was Calcutta then, now it's become Kolkata, and Shanghai. And these were cities that were completely different from the way we know them today. And the trip extended, actually, interestingly, his urban design thesis, which was an investigation on the changing middle landscape in America, which was also something people are beginning to take notice of then as a phenomena and begin to understand it. So it was cutting edge in terms of concerns at that point. Bill is a practicing architect. Since he graduated, he set up his practice in partnership with Nancy Shapiro. Shapiro McElroy Designs is their design studio based here in Boston. And over the last 20 years, the firm has designed and built projects ranging from houses to gardens to buildings, landscapes for small institutions, to urban design plans and code, etc. The defining theme of the practice is the exploration of the relationship between buildings, landscape, and the people who inhabit them, and they're really concerned with craft, building materials, details. Bill was here in the urban design program at the GST, and a couple of years after returning from the Druker Fellowship, he built his own house and an attached studio on a shared infill lot in JP, Jamaica Plains. He said to me that it really is, through the house, and he was lucky to do the house at that point, that he captured many ideas and experiences through his travels on the fellowship. So let's start with you, Bill. Thanks.
What a pleasure to participate in this afternoon's event as the first Druker Fellow. Thank you to Ron. Especially a joy to be here with Rahul, my classmate and my friend, for close to now 30 years. Rahul, you've taken my introduction away. I can just launch right into the presentation. In those travels that I made, I made a reading of each significant place I came across through photography, field notes, and sketches, documenting their typological and mythic qualities that were an extension of my thesis. And after 6 months of travel, the material was synthesized and compared cross-culturally with the American context of my thesis in a series of abstract drawings and collages, some of which I'm going to show you this afternoon. So as a lead-in, I want to start with a few images from my thesis, a research and design thesis that I did with Peter Rowe. This is an abstract drawing of Boston that explores the relationship between its edge and its center. This edge condition, termed the middle landscape, one that Alex Krieger, in his very popular course on the American city, discussed quite a bit, is quintessentially American. A space that's undergone tremendous transformation. And I focused in my thesis on Burlington, Massachusetts, a community that started of farms, became a New England town, a suburb, and is now immersed in urbanization. In this sketch, that is Burlington. The building block of Burlington is its vernacular house, bastion of individualism, under siege now due to changing family groups, attainability, mortgage foreclosure. The figure ground with all those dots, to me, in my thesis, suggested that it didn't add up to much more than the sum of its parts. The house's corollary is Burlington Strip, its collective arena. Here, almost totally taken over by the car, it has been robbed, the environment has been robbed of its main street and common connections and its vitality. My urban design strategy in Burlington was to shift the center of gravity away from the Strip and back towards the historic heart of the Common and its main streets by changing it with new use. I proposed two interventions. One at the high point of this community was a community meeting house complex constructed on a platform with an urban armature comprised of a support wall and pavilions for public occasions. That's seen on the left. On the right, at the low point of the community, down by the Strip, a municipal waterworks service complex was designed to treat stormwater off the Strip as it ran off, an educational facility highlighting the ecology of the area, public access to the marshlands, and commercial greenhouses as a gesture to the consumption of the Strip. This is a map of my itinerary that I went on with my travel companion, Nancy Shapiro, that Rahul mentioned, landscape architect who I met here at the GSD. You know, in those days, what you did, if you got such a generous grant as the Druker, you just bought a plane ticket. In this case, we landed in Bombay, slightly softened because we got to stay at Rahul's family place in the city, and bought a rail pass, second class, and just took off. We traveled on bus, ferry, boat, jeep. We hitchhiked, and by foot. There were a couple plane flights as well. The trip took on a life of its own. I was looking for examples of memorable juxtapositions of urban form and landscape that, as an urban designer and architect, I could add to my repertoire of influences and inspiration for building in the American middle landscape. To set the context, much of my time was spent on the street. It was intense. And yet from the street, you could step into another world, as Alice might go through the looking glass, into these sensationally exotic places for me. I had never been to Asia before. These are of Calcutta and Agra. I also, in Calcutta, on the Maidan overlooking the Victoria Memorial, saw this temporary structure that made me think back to the thesis model and its armature overlooking the Common. In Bombay, I visited the Bangaga Sacred Tank, a place of praying, cleansing, and festivals. On Wakeshwar Temple, a high point in the city, and the place of focus of a book that Rahul authored. The image on the right is of Sukhaj Temple and Stepwell Complex. You'll find that water is a recurring theme in these images. Outside Delhi, Nancy and I went to Fatehpur Sikri, a Mughal capital. It was built in the mid-1500s and abandoned 14 years after due to lack of water. The drawing on the left is of the emperor's private court, and on the left side of that drawing is the Panch Mahal, the highest pavilion of Akbar's favorite place to contemplate the heavens and life under them. These images are of the Jantar Mantar in Jaipur in Rajasthan, built in 1730. They were astrological observatories, instruments so large that they became buildings in themselves, with interior chambers, steps, doors, and windows. The largest shown here is Samrat Yantra, over 100 feet high. The detail shows white marble incised with graduations, marking altitude, azimuth circles, and meridians. Time and memory were recurring themes through all the places that we went to visit. We went to Benares, founded in the 8th century BC, on the Ganga, one of the oldest cities in the world. This is a map by James Prinsep of 1822, and I know of no greater urban design map than this, a fantastic delineation project based on 10 years of his residency in Benares. The Ghats are stepped down to the river, and this particular Ghat is the Chamsati Ghat, and the images are of the Ghat at dawn. At the top is the temple of the 64 yoginis, or sorceresses. The image on the left shows the Ghats, the Ganga, and the city fabric above, comprised of temples and mosques, mansions and gardens, bazaars and alleys. It's an abstract drawing that I did upon my return, again based in part on memory. The drawing on the left is a in-the-field sketch, and the photograph on the right is of a priest sitting on a platform under a bamboo umbrella, administering to the pilgrims that would come here daily at dawn. We also went to Srinagar, another remarkable city in the Vale of Kashmir, sadly almost impossible to visit ever since we went there. Founded in the 12th century BC, it's on the River Jhelum and Dal Lake. It's a network of canals, monumental stone retaining walls, ghats interspersed with gardens, houses, mosques, temples, schools, and shops, all at the river's edge. Interestingly, the houseboats, called dongas, are low-income housing, and we stayed on one for a period of time. These are images of the Mughal gardens approach from Lake Dal, and this one is called Nisha Bagh from 1625. It's spectacularly sited, tucked up into the mountains that rise behind it, and it shows a linear progression of pavilions and water features and channels, originally on 12 terraces, one for each sign of the zodiac. This arched retaining wall, 20 feet high, is flanked on either side by balconied pavilions, once lodging women's quarters and only accessed by the emperor himself. Nearby in northern India, we went to see some of the polychrome vernacular houses, this one near Dharamsala, the seat of the exiled Dalai Lama. We went to Le Corbusier's Sarabhai house from 1951 in Ahmedabad for one of the textile families. The layout is defined by the direction of the wind from the southeast to the northwest and the brise-soleil veranda that sets up the rhythm of a sequence of 10 rows of Catalan vaults made of brick tiles with no formwork, supported by 11 brick load-bearing walls. The diagonal line of sight through the openings in these walls allows each person in the house to sense each other's presence. And that large pivoting door on the left with its small glazed opening is a device that I think Rahul and Nancy and I, and Chinu, have tried to sneak in almost every project we've ever done since. We also made our way up to Ladakh, a vast and remote place in India politically, but on the Tibetan plateau. We saw a couple of monasteries called Gompas, and this one is Tixi from the 15th century. Perched on an east-facing slope high above the Indus River, it's a pyramidal complex comprised of prayer halls, library, chortens, mani walls, prayer wheels, and a roof terrace is seen on the left, from which you can look down onto the village below with their threshing floors and fodder spread out on the flat roofs for hay and animals. The second Gompa is Hemis, founded in the 16th century, a great courtyard complex overlooked by skeletal wood galleries, scenes of ceremonial dances, and from this section done in the field, skylit prayer halls. This is a plan on the left that shows the prayer halls and the cluster of monks' cells defining the courtyard in the landscape. One of our many side trips was to Patan in the Kathmandu Valley, an ancient kingdom capital and one of the great urban spaces in the world. The royal complex of courtyards overlooking the palace gardens was delineated by me upon my return in this drawing on the left. The open space was described by dwellings, and in the space in between the palace and the edge condition were all these tiered pagoda platforms with temples on them built by royalty in memory of their parents. Going through one of these temple courtyard entries, you'd enter, as some of the first images I showed, into this inner world, a place of intense red brick, copper, bronze doors, and intimate carvings. The landscape intensification through the views from within the city fabric is shown on the left. And again, in the spirit of water, monuments, a tank on the right. It's nice for me to see Mark Mulligan here, because at this time, Mark was probably just going over to Maki's office for a 7-year stint. This is the Shinjuku in Tokyo, the busiest place and the largest train station in the world, where 4 million souls go through daily. The drawing on the left tries to express the juxtaposition of scales and energy in this place. And yet, as you would step, as we did in Agra and Calcutta, off of these public spaces, down an alleyway, you'd find these ramen noodle outdoor places. And that juxtaposition I found quite remarkable. We visited Taiyo Ito's home from 1984, as seen here in a picture on the right of Taiyo Ito and Nancy. Called the Silver Hut, he juxtaposed the primitive hut idea with high-tech space station technology, and I think very nicely captured the surrealness of the Shinjuku with that sense of nature and archaicness in Japan. The image on the left shows Tadao Ando's commercial building, the Times building in Kyoto, that faces the canal. And not unlike a Kyoto street, the sense of scale, in this case with Ando, rendered in concrete and steel and glass, is still continuous. And now to China. As Rahul mentioned, I had proposed to go to Shanghai, but there was a hepatitis outbreak, and so the China leg was redirected out to the southwest towards Kunming. We visited several extraordinary minority settlements to requalify the research, and I want to show you 2 of them. These are some of the amazing rice terraces that we saw on the way. The fields and the villages tucked up against the mountains. Modes of transport, bridges, bicycling, and a most remarkable piece of urban design at the small scale, a bus stop in Yangshuo. A civic totem, an urban monument, to be sure. Dali, one of the 2 settlements that I want to show you from the minority region, is comprised of a sequence of smaller villages entirely built of stone situated on a fertile plain between Erhai Lake and a mountain range in a vigorously geometric pattern in counterpoint to the landscape. This was a place that Marco Polo traveled through. It dates from the 8th century BC, and from these images, it was the capital kingdom of Dali. A in-the-field sketch of the urban form, and an image on the right of approaching one of the walled settlements. Another sketch and a view of the lake. These homes were remarkably built. They were exquisite. And the pagodas, the gates, the walls, the pavilions, the network of streets, culminating in courtyards, added to an intrinsic landscape, urban landscape. The laneways. This is Sanjiang, home of the Dong, an ancient people who are animists and Buddhists. And that wind and rain bridge, 250 feet in length, is, in my mind, an urban armature supreme. Think thesis project. Benches, cool hanging out places to catch the breezes coming down the river valley, agricultural records carved into the beaming, and amulets hanging from the roof forms. A section of the bridge, and their most ingenious water wheels. Again, I'm just thinking of waterworks in general. The open space and the cluster of housing. And the bridges from the larger size to smaller and finally footbridges. And finally, the drum towers, a kind of meeting house, not unlike Burlington, with benches and tables for communal gatherings that rise up over the houses and summon villagers to warn against attack. I want to end with a couple images. A kind of then and now thing. This is of Rahul and I in our first term of our first year working on our first project. In the studio, late at night. We were brought together, apparently through a lottery, to do a group project. I've always wondered if it was by coincidence or by design. I think it was by fate, and it's remarkable that we are here today and are going to participate in this afternoon together. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. My gosh, what a throwback. God, really. Okay, so our next presenter, Jan Cornel. Jan, is your stuff loaded up? Not yet. Okay, so Jan decided to make the jump from slides to scan her material, and she's having problems with the technology. So we're going to bump her to the third sort of presentation. So we'll move on to Frank Ricciala, who received the fellowship in 2002. And the project that was funded through the fellowship, he examined the world's airports and the areas immediately around them as they begin to rival the traditional downtowns as the focus of urban regions. In 2002, so this was the beginning of the global world and concerns with infrastructure such as this and with connectivity, etc. So it's interesting to see that shift at the end of the decade, so to speak. Frank is an associate urban planner and a designer for New York's Department of City Planning, where he oversees projects in Midtown Manhattan, Hudson Yards. He's also an adjunct assistant professor in urban design at Columbia University. His study of Los Angeles' oil fields was published in Infrastructural City, Networked Ecologies in Los Angeles, which was published in 2002, and he was awarded the Graham Foundation Research Grant in 2010. Additionally, Frank's competition entries and research projects done in collaboration with DUB Studios, have been exhibited and published internationally, most recently as a winner of the Long Island Index's Build a Better Burb competition. And so with that, Frank, over to you. Thanks. Are you all loaded up? Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's your controls.
Oh, wow.
There's your pointer. Okay.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Okay, so I can't imagine a different type of presentation or looking at a different series of things between these two. So as Rahul said, I looked at airports and really the areas around them. And this started for me really from something I kept seeing in the newspaper. And let me see if I can do this. Right there, Rosemont, Illinois. And you would see articles appearing about major events, conventions going on there. And you were like, well, what's Rosemont, Illinois? Rosemont is this little town of 4,000 people. Oddly enough, though, Rosemont has one of the largest convention centers in the United States. Rosemont has a major kind of music hall, a John Portman design building, its own arena. It's a town of 4,000 people. And maybe this kind of begins to give it away. It has a number of office centers, many of them named after a place that some of us know very well, O'Hare International Airport. Rosemont, right over there, sits directly adjacent to our O'Hare International Airport, which at the time that I was doing this travel was the world's largest airport. And what I was always fascinated by was this idea that these airports, and particularly the global airports of the world, and how they were beginning to develop their own urban form around themselves. And this as an idea was something that I think architects and planners have always been interested in. Frank Lloyd Wright on the left here, always fascinated by the idea of travel and air travel and how that would affect the city, and of course Corb also. And what I was interested in was both the kind of existence of this phenomena, but also how architects and planners were beginning to look at this themselves and actually begin to formalize this as an idea of urbanism. And these are just some of the images that you'd find, always, of course, cut off because it's hard to put a tall building next to an airport. So you were always seeing these kind of very cut off series of buildings, but really beginning to look at what were these places that we, as architects and planners, were beginning to design around airports. So I proposed as part of, and one of the things I should also just say is if slides were something that was kind of hard for us to find, it was amazing that this was done 10 years ago and was right at the cusp of finding these things. I found like the last disc that I had of this, and it was kind of always nervous. I was like, what if I don't have any slides from this presentation? So luckily I did. But I put together a proposal for the Druker Fellowship called Airport Urbanism, with the idea that I would travel to these places, and the attempt of this was actually to travel continuously and to kind of live the lifestyle of someone in this world of airport urbanism, really a kind of jet-lagged world. And I stayed in as many airport hotels as I could find, and kind of continually that travel to really get a sense of this place and see how different it was from, I guess you would say, the rest of the city. I had an itinerary, and I think this kind of speaks to the point of the different, as times have changed, that was able to be a much more kind of expansive globally, traveling from starting in New York and kind of ending in New York also, but really traveling around the globe, looking at the series of places, some of which, like O'Hare, had developed a kind of its own kind of adjacent urbanism on its own, and then places that were beginning to actually have more formal design thought as to what should be next to an airport, Incheon, Hong Kong, and places like Schiphol too. And so, this somehow not image missing, but really, starting with that kind of idea of this informal growth and seeing the kind of landscapes that get created around these airports. And around O'Hare is this kind of fascinating. It's the world's largest industrial park, located directly across from the airport. And the reason being because you couldn't build anything below the flight paths. And so at first it started off as just an idea of something to do with the land, but over time became one of the major economic hubs of the Chicago region. But what we were beginning to find was that you were also beginning to see residential growth around there. So many people are beginning to travel around the world that you were actually finding housing that was developing. This in Dallas. Directly adjacent to the airport because people were living a lifestyle that's where they wanted to live. But the thing that, that's odd. Oh, that's actually funny. The other thing that you find again around airports that, especially in US airports, was a kind of a series of uses that no one wanted anywhere else, strip clubs. I didn't use any Druker funding for strip clubs, just to be honest. But that you would begin, you begin to find them, and actually the fascinating thing was they would actually become to be named after them. This was called the landing strip, right? And you would see that the airport and the kind of areas and the uses around them really were beginning to kind of really connect to one another. But then looking at places that were a little bit more kind of formally thought about as how should an airport really relate to its region and really what kind of growth should develop within it. And of course, the one that really, the term I've always used about it is probably annoyingly perfect is Schiphol in Amsterdam. One of the things I'll just say about this is much of this travel was done right after September 11th. And if you were ever traveling around that time period, the idea that you would have a camera and you'd be taking photos of things pretty much was a sign that you were going to be getting arrested. So many of these photos are really taken either really early in the morning or just kind of sneaking onto the side so no one saw that I was trying to take a photo of things. I had moments as this trip where I'd be driving a rental car around parts of the airport and all of a sudden I'd realize there was a cop car around looking and kind of trying to or following me around the airport and began to realize I should probably get out of here quickly. But Schiphol, that place that actually is probably the best example of this blending of a variety of uses, both hotels and office and open space, probably the only functioning, successful urban plaza I've ever seen in an airport, but even just in the airport itself and how all of these things blend. And probably one of my most fascinating places on the trip was in a kind of outdoor public space that one could actually just stand and kind of just view the planes as they traveled. But I think one of the things and what I took from this was, or Schiphol was this kind of amazing example of this when seeing how this was being replicated around the world in other places, that we were, as designers and planners, really somehow missing something. And I think that was the thing that kind of struck me as I was doing this travel, looking at the places that were doing this more formally. Incheon is the international airport for Seoul, and built on not an artificial island, but built more recently as a kind of major airport complex. Switching that around on the side, there's the major terminal, but one of the things that I was always fascinated by was what there was called the International Business Development Area adjacent to it. And the idea of this was to be something like Schiphol, to be this area that would be a major office complex, major hotel complex for international business that would be coming through Incheon. But I think one of the things that what you would find in these places was just how empty they were or how unlively they were. Somehow, and this being the kind of example of just this one example, but that overall seeing this was repeated in places over and over. Again, Hong Kong, a similar condition, that the areas around the airport, which were focused to be these new kind of energetic airport-based cities, really were not really working. And then the other thing around Incheon, actually just right next to the airport, was actually a place that was really functioning as a city, which was called Airport Town Square. This was actually the place located where all of the workers of the airport were supposed to live. And though it was an amazingly lively place, and actually what was so fascinating was somehow, let me just go to this, that's Airport Town Square, which was the actual interesting kind of energetic place of Incheon, the area that was supposed to be the fascinating and energetic place of Incheon was really, really failing. And even when you look back at this was 7 or 8 years ago, actually more like 10 years ago, that's still true today. And it's kind of something, it's never kind of caught on. And this is something that I've seen in a number of places like this. And I think for me, I wrote, I was able to find the kind of original application I wrote for it, and I wrote it and as this kind of extremely energetic view that this was the future of the city. But in doing the travel, actually, I think I began to realize that, in fact, actually, that may not yet be true. There's something still missing. And so every time I see people who have that kind of same realization or same kind of viewpoint, Aerotropolis is a book that came out, I think, about a year ago. I've always kind of been a little bit hesitant about that these days, when actually having that travel has been something that's kind of really stood out for me. But I think the other thing that struck me about the travel of the Druker, and I think it relates to a lot of what I do today in Manhattan, is where, I wrote this kind of as this idea that the city is done, the airport is really where it's at. And one of the things on the trip, as much as I was kind of living the world of the airport, I would spend much of my time actually also going around the rest of these cities. And I think one of the things I was most fascinated by on this trip was seeing the new, or the kind of amazing amount of new construction and new cities that were really being built in the world. Hong Kong and just the kind of amazingness of central London, and surprisingly the amazing amount of construction in central London, Dubai. Actually, it was just amazing to see Dubai as it was really beginning to pop and grow. But the idea that bringing that back to New York, and that we think of, when I think of New York as a place that's kind of the center of the universe, but even some of our most kind of cherished places in the city have really not changed for over 50 years, right? And this idea that was something that I think I've taken from the Druker that I think was something different than I ever would have expected. I write this as actually mock Grand Central Station, and today I think that's the thing I've taken most from it, is this fact that this is the thing I work on basically for the rest, or all of my life these days. But this idea that this travel and beginning to see these cities and how they're growing was kind of the thing I took most from it. So thank you so much for this travel, Mr. Druker. So that's kind of it. Thanks.
Jan, is she here? Oh, she's left the room, my gosh. Technology has failed. I mean, we could start the panel discussion and get her to maybe present later. Yeah, let's do that so we can, yeah. So why don't we begin to talk? I'm sorry that she, would you just see? Maybe she can just speak for a few minutes if she's here. That's interesting how she tried to make the jump to the new technology. Bill, you were right in staying with the slides. Maybe we should start the conversation, I think, and if she joins us, she can talk. Come, Bill, if you would. Yeah. So thanks very much for sharing those experiences and the images, and it's interesting in just that, 15 years, what a jump in terms of what you could access and the issues as they were changing. And I was struck by, Ron, your comments about urban design and what it means and how it's been fuzzy in the conference. That a whole day was spent in trying to figure it out. And I often say this to my students, that for me, graduating, and now you've seen what I looked like when I graduated, I went, I went away, with an understanding of urban design, which was, as I say, very much about advocacy, because it really was the way one understood it, about trying to create a bridge discipline or a bridge practice between the abstraction of planning, which had become two-dimensional, oriented to policy, and the site specificity of architecture, which had become very blinkered-eyed in terms of looking at a site. And urban design, in a sense, was a practice or a training where architects were made to understand the language of planners, become familiar and confident to even engage with those issues, and create these critical feedback loops that would inform each of those practices. And inherent in that, when it does become a feedback loop, in order to keep it dynamic, it has to be about advocacy and engagement. And so I went back to India to practice with that learning, where one was dealing with many forces, political, financial, and trying to see what implications they had on form. And it was interesting because I only came back here after 15 or 20 years, and friends would say, show me your portfolio, what have you done on urban design? And actually it was policy documents, and it was conservation policy, etc. It was because what had happened here soon after we graduated was that that urban design got co-opted by the market-driven city construction, which means it became big architecture. I remember when I was graduating Battery Park City, these were the projects that were being celebrated as big fragments of the city. And so urban designers became ones, at least in the Western context, engaged with big architecture. And so this was a complete difference in terms of how, and you could, I think it could be legitimate across that whole spectrum of engagement. So I just wanted to, I was curious, and I'm sorry that Jan sort of is not here.
She's dealing with the
technical aspects, and maybe we'll give her a few minutes for presentation after this. Is how did you reflect on that? Because you were exposed to a whole spectrum of issues. You went out of here with a training in urban design or conception of urban design, and how did the exposure to a completely different context inform that process, or your own understanding or constructing in your mind how you might practice urban design eventually?
Well, when I came to the program in 1985, I came from Canada, and most architects in Toronto, the city that I hailed from, thought to be a good architect was to also be interested in the city. There was never a split in their minds. So to practice architecture was to practice urban design. But in Canada, there was no urban design program. So I came to Harvard to gain the skills that would allow me to talk more literally about urban morphology, typology, and all the aspects that we now know as urban design. It was my first year with Rahul that Peter Rowe's first year as chairman of the urban design program.
That's correct.
And Peter, very open in temperament, had an agenda. And I recall him telling us as a class, he wanted to make a bridge between architecture and landscape architecture and urban design. And he encouraged us as students to take classes at the Kennedy School and to take classes at the Carpenter Center. Rahul and I took a very interesting urban theory course with John Whiteman, and a class that Alex Krieger taught on the American City that I mentioned in my chat. There was a diversity of approach, which I think was in contradiction to the practices approach, which was trying to qualify and package urban design as this consumable expertise that could be sold to all takers and comers. When I graduated, worked briefly with Alex Krieger, and that was a rewarding experience for me because we worked on the Roslindale Master Plan. Coincidentally, as Rahul touched on, I live within 15 minutes walking distance from that master plan site. So my experience was one of graduation and integration, but I think that was by choice and not by the momentum of the field. So in some ways, I'm talking to you as someone on the margins of urban design as it's practiced in the field today. I work as an urban designer. I work as an architect. My wife is a landscape architect. We've been involved in product design and zoning consultation. It's as diverse as the opportunities allow for. And I support that attitude towards urban design, where something as small as that bus stop in Yangshuo that I showed can still be seen as something that's relevant to the profession. At the same time, overarching ideas at the regional scale is critical to think about as well. I think it's all scales.
Frank?
I think actually it's good that you ended on that word, because I think that's what I took from my travel, was that even at the larger scale of urban design, when you have to think about the scale of a runway, the runway is something like, it could be over a mile long, and that is just a scale that is planners, urban designers, just really a scale that's kind of beyond most of us. And so that, I think for me, was something that when experiencing these places, you were beginning to realize this is a scale that most of us never, ever really operate on, kind of the larger end of that scale.
I'm going to turn to Guy Perry, who got the fellowship the year after Bill McElroy, and you did airports too,
Yeah.
didn't you? Yeah. So I just wanted some thoughts or reflections on what you saw of a project a decade later.
Well, for me, it was obviously
Get the mic.
fascinating, and I visited a number of the same airports, although the one in Seoul wasn't built yet. But mine was perhaps a little bit more of a political study. I did a civil engineering course at MIT in airport design, and then I was over at the Fletcher School of Diplomacy at Tufts. And I ended up traveling to some very unusual places at the time. The Soviet Union, still the Soviet Union. I went to also to Egypt and Saudi Arabia, because there's the Hajj terminal, also fantastic, the Skidmore terminal. And basically I was trying to see how the international airport system, which was a universal system with the same planes, the same basic infrastructure, how it would transition to these different cultures and different political systems. But it was certainly an adventure, and took me to some places I never would have gone otherwise. I mean, whether it was Moscow or even ended up at Tbilisi, Georgia. Well, at that time it was still the Soviet Union, but in Kashmir, I was up in Kashmir as well, for airports, right? But I was also on the houseboat. But indeed, you have to really want to do that kind of travel.
Yeah.
That long ago, 24 years ago, it was a bit tougher then.
Thanks, Guy. Jen, I know you haven't yet made your presentation, but we're just sort of reflecting on.
Here's the messenger.
Here's
Thank
the-
you,
here's the-
Nancy. Oh, my God.
So, we were just reflecting about what one sort of got from this, and urban design, and how you sort of frame it, and all of that. And you traveled in 96,
1996.
which
and-
is sort of exactly sort of halfway between.
Well,
these.
95 was when I got the scholarship, and I went in 96, 97. And I guess for me, it was a chance to come to sort of verify and fall from grace in a way. In many ways, it was a real kind of reality check on a lot of the romantic notions I had about the particular area of study I was really fascinated in, which was the role of urban design and planning in support of economic development strategies. So that, and I apologize. I have a show.
We're going to go on after we finish this. So
Okay.
but you can talk about things that we should watch out for in your presentation, if you like. But I also want to sort of, are there questions from folks in the audience or other fellows who might want to sort of add to some of these reflections? Gerald. Yeah.
So coming back to the idea of the fellowship, one could imagine, let's say, in an oversimplified way at extremes, just a year or 6 months of travel, or whatever it might be. Unstructured, you have an idea, it's just an idea, and you sort of really build what you almost said you did. You got on a plane, you went over, and then you started traveling and going around. All the way to the much, much, much more structured kind of thing thought through in advance, vetted by a committee that no longer has Ron on it. We're really, it's the good news. No, it isn't. But we really take seriously, all of these proposals from throughout the school, by the way. It's not just limited to urban design students, and they're finalists, and it's the faculty in selecting takes this all very, very seriously, heavily scripted in advance proposals. And Frank, we haven't seen Jan where you fit in. Frank, yours was a little more of, at least conceptually, you had a real, more of an idea, but still even today we're more so. I wonder on that range where you think you get more out of it, personally and professionally in your career.
Thank you, Gerald.
Yeah. Well, I could certainly say that what I got out of what I did has been something that has sustained me and my travel partners' practice, been an inspiration, touchstone, all these years. I don't think that we could have scripted that trip had we sat down and made a proposal in the way that one might write a master's urban design thesis. I think a master's urban design thesis is something different. I think what my trip allowed me and Nancy to do was to take the gift of Ron Druker's generosity at a time when most students are at their financial bottom and broke, as I was.
I concur with that.
Graduated without a diploma in that envelope because I hadn't paid my last term bill, something my parents didn't even know about. They would have died had that been the case, exposed to them, and took that money and went on a trip when, after 2 years of UD study, you are most open and receptive to new ideas. Just a fantastic concept that you would extend the trip, the experience of the graduate degree through a bounce that could take you anywhere in the world. When Peter Rowe gave me the check to do this trip, he said it was the largest amount of money he'd ever given a student. And with
it
that,
wasn't anything like it is today.
I know that. I know that. But those were days long ago. And so I think that to leave something of the experience up to intuition, spontaneity, sense of adventure, risk-taking, these are good things and things that I would personally like to see engendered in future Druker fellowships.
I think I had where I had the, instead of buying one ticket, I had to actually buy something like 12 tickets in a row. And so it was this kind of amazing effort of planning to try to do this all at once. And but within that, I think I had the luck of actually spending, you can only spend so much time in an airport before you kind of start going crazy. So I started beginning to take rent cars or however I could get out of the airport. And to begin to kind of just explore other cities or places around. For me, one of the ones that was most, I think, phenomenal was while in England and had to drive on the wrong side of the road, I was able to go up to just the Lake District up in England, and it was a place that I had just never been to, but I had seen it. It looked really beautiful in photos, and to me, it's still one of those places that I was so glad I went to because it just kind of changed. I'm from New York, and really, Central Park is about the kind of the most nature I think I'd seen really in my life. And so to kind of go to a place like that, I think it was just a kind of really changing experience and, had nothing at all, admittedly, to do with the actual award. But for me, it was actually something.
So you'll admit to that, but
not the strip clubs. Right.
we endorse that.
Well, for me, I had traveled a lot, before I came to the GSD. I'd been in Africa and all over Europe. My family lives in Norway, so I'd spent quite a bit of time kind of getting to Norway via other routes throughout my life. So for me, the grant was really an opportunity to go to, in a much more sort of focused, precise way, to a couple of specific places, and I lived with the people. I lived in the bed of one of my fellow students from Taiwan. I stayed in his bedroom, and his mother made me toast and stuff like that. And in Italy, you know, I got very much acquainted with a lot of different people, and I kind of had a whole different focus in on what the culture and the issues and the challenges and the things that they were doing there. So for me, that was the beauty of it. I had an inkling. I had no idea what I was getting into, but I had this opportunity to really go and drill deeper into things that I had only skimmed the surface of here in Cambridge.
Any other questions?
One question for Frank. You did a lot of work at airports, and I noticed that you're now you're planning in Midtown.
Mhm.
Yeah, is there any reason that you didn't extend what you learned to the airports, even though they are Port Authority airports, but to the environment of the airports?
You know, I think it's funny. Like I think the idea when I wrote, it's even funny when I read this still. There was it was like I had a view that this was the right way of the city and urbanism moving forward. And I think the trip to me actually, actually in some ways disproved it. Right? Sometimes the trip is actually not an affirmation; it's actually kind of negation of the original idea, which is actually a worthwhile thing to have happen. And I think I still love them. You know, it was great just getting up here today and getting to go up through LaGuardia. It's just always fun to me to go through an airport. But I don't know, you know, it's just was a different, in some respects, a different time too, I think, that coming back, it just seemed more fun to work for the rest of the city. I don't know why, yeah.
I have one question before we move on to Jan's presentation. You know, it's interesting. By the time we come to 2002, I think it's thematic in a sense. I mean, Guy, you were looking at airports, but I think the first applicants were more about geography and getting to places which weren't so accessible. There wasn't the internet. The choices had to partly do with familiarity, either friends you had who you could, you know, connect and make networks to, no internet. So I'm just sort of curious, what drove your choices in terms of where you wanted to go? I mean, I see Italy and Taipei, you know, they're kind of disparate pieces and very expansive geographies in all these three cases. So I just sort of, how did you?
For me, it was research, and it was really like looking at a series of different types of airport places. And so that it was, I think, and it actually speaks to this, there was an ability at that point to actually begin to do that kind of level of research, whether that be, I think Google Maps existed, I'm pretty sure.
Just about, yeah.
Just, right, but also just the internet and be able to find so much more information. And so for me, it was a trip that I was able to do almost without having to talk to anyone, right? Except like when you would get to those places and kind of try to visit the planning departments of those airports. But I could, at that point, do that kind of level of travel, which I think it's totally true. You probably couldn't really do 20 years ago. It's just fascinating. Right?
Well, in my research that I did here at the GSD, and I had come across these two places. I hadn't found anything else in any of the work that I did where there was this combination of a network-based economy, like it was like a whole bunch of little small companies that were working together, combined with a deliberate goal by the planning and the design entities in the cities to support this kind of socially equitable arrangement of working. So that's why these were two places. There was like one article in like some random magazine on Modena, Italy. I saw a picture of a particular typology, and but that was it. There was not, I couldn't find anything else, and it was like, okay, someone's got to go look at this stuff, because there's nothing in the Widener Library or the Harvard libraries or MIT library system that shows anything. So that was kind of why I went to those two places.
It's fascinating. Probably there's a point where, because both the amount of travel that's been done through the Druker over time, but also just because it is so much easier to travel, the bar has to get raised each time. It's like, you know, what is a new compelling idea that hasn't been looked at, because it is so much easier to travel. And there's actually just more discourse globally around these issues.
No, and because it's so much easier to travel, I know Felipe and others who are involved in the selection now have to sharpen their parameters in terms of thematic contents or underlying theoretical constructs that might benefit from this kind of travel. Bill, do you want to?
You know, for me, in contradiction to that comment, it was a very personal decision. I had traveled some extensively through North America and Europe, but I'd never been to Asia. In my urban and Rahul's urban design class, there were several Americans, there were a couple Canadians, there were 4 from Taiwan, there was a Japanese, there was a Hong Kong Chinese, there was an Australian, and there were 2 Indians. So there was, in the class complexion, this amount of Asianness that piqued my curiosity. And it was through my friendship with you, through my connection with Nancy Shapiro, who had lived in Hong Kong, where she taught and studied for 2 years before coming to the GSD, that my curiosity was piqued. I wanted to go to these places. And so it was not like I had some theory that I had generated in my head and went out to seek and prove. There wasn't an axiom. It was truly in the spirit of personal exploration and adventure. And I recall talking with you about wanting to go to India. Where should I go that was appropriate as an extension of the middle landscape experience? And you said, try Calcutta. And that's how Tokyo came around as well. So it was a more intuitive approach.
Thanks. So with that, Jan, let's get to your presentation. I should have done this before you sat here, but I'm going to introduce you as you set up. Jan traveled to Modena in Italy and Taipei. And like she said, she wanted to understand firsthand the physical implications of decentralized industrial organization, its relationship to building typology and city form. She got the fellowship in 1995. She studied architecture and urban design and has been working as a planning and urban design consultant for 20 years, working on university campuses and a whole sort of gamut of projects. She was a principal at Sasaki Associates for 10 years and was the design lead on master plans for UC Berkeley, the University of Texas in Austin, Portland State University, downtown Rochester, Minnesota, and many, many others. And she's been working and interested in working with community groups as well as private clients and the government. She has been interested in trying to align research, innovation, design within these large-scale projects. So, Jan, all yours.
Thanks, Rahul. So that was a good summary. I have been fascinated by the allure of the industrial fabric of our cities since I was a teenager. And God, that sounds like a long time ago. And both in terms of kind of a nostalgia for the form and the scale and the purity, the honesty of kind of showing how things work, and that we are all of us creative souls, and is there a way to kind of maintain that notion that work, that cities can reflect the work that we do and the things we make. And both in terms of the form and the possibilities for the kind of dynamism and the kinetic quality of the industrial fabric of our cities. I've also lamented the decay that's occurred, you know, in most American cities. This is Toronto. This is taken in the late '80s, and it's one of the areas that now is and was starting to occur back then, is now platted in a regular urban way, in a very honest, good urban way, with lots of the same looking 5, 6-story housing development with mixed-use development. And I was watching all of my favorite places and unique kind of industrial fabric disappearing at that time, in Boston as well, and wondering what I was going to do about that. So for me, the Druker Scholarship was really about the chance to go and find some things that might help me in my life's work to better understand the interrelationship between urban design, planning, and economic forces that are at work. So what was it like in 1995? One of the things that was happening and had been happening for decades and continued to happen for decades after I went to Italy and Taiwan was that manufacturing continues to decline. It's only now that we're starting to see a kind of a very tentative leveling out of those notions, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We were reading things like Manuel Castells and Saskia Sassen, and these were early. This was early on. This was, oh my God, it's a global economy emerging, and people are connecting in different ways via technology that we never imagined they would be. And there was also this this investigation that I was kind of at the fringe around how small-scale manufacturing might still exist in different forms than it had existed in you know, in the height of the industrial age. There was also all over in San Francisco, in all the big cities, or many of the big cities, there was this boom around and this new idea of live-work and how we could build this new kind of housing where people could live and work in the same place. And I was just like, yeah, right on. That's the future. Live, work. People should, you know, roll out of bed and go down to the floor and, you know, build something. That was 1995. The Widener was where I did my research, and MIT, as many of you have talked about before. I was right at the cutting edge of, I was one of the first people to get a MacBook, and it had 8 megabytes of RAM. And it cost a fortune, and it fell apart in a year and a half. It was a piece of junk. But that's, and I had a modem, a cable, like a modem thing you could stick in it and put in the telephone line and send a fax to somebody. That's where we were. There was no commercial internet at that point. And this is relevant not just because of the research, but also because of the possibilities the internet has created for this particular topic of the network-based economy. So I went to Taipei and to Modena, Italy. And as I mentioned, these were two places where I had heard a lot about the success of the planning, a deliberate planning policy and urban design strategy to support and sustain economic growth, competitive globally economic growth. I don't just mean informal economies, but I mean economies that were competing internationally in this kind of small and medium-sized business model. So not big corporations, not big companies that were kind of taking up most of or doing most of the manufacturing work. So these two places, for cultural reasons and for political reasons, had since the Second World War really supported the Second World War, the Chinese Revolution type Taiwan's case, had really supported this self-reliant entrepreneurial kind of cultural experiment around economic development. I'm going to just get right in, and I'm going to try to do this, and it's going to maybe work because it was 1995, and I had my sister, who's a filmmaker and teacher in Norway. She, at the time, was just kind of learning how to use her camera, and she came with me to Modena. So let me see. What did I just do? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. So Taiwan. In Taiwan, every living room is a factory. That was the slogan that was the government slogan from after the from when Taiwan was established. In Taipei, the government nurtured an independent, self-reliant economy, as I said. Parts of Taipei were characterized by this very integrated form of little companies that were all in the shops, in the storefront shops, working on machines, producing products for export. In Taiwan, the policy in urban areas was all really about how to manage land and how to equalize the value of land to give people opportunities. In Modena, there's a deliberate planning following the war to really create a system that was in support of these networks of emerging little industries, and it came out of a very volatile time after the war, when the government decided to support the entrepreneurs and not rely on the big economic engines, the industries that had been there before. You're going to see a little interview. I'm going to shut up for a minute. Here we were visiting the apartment that this family lived in above their workshop, where they produced parts for Porsches.
Alla presenza dei clienti che dicono: vado da Bartoli perché abita lì, perciò io suono il campanello, lui viene giù di sera, di sabato, di domenica. Non è bello questo. Il cliente però è contento di questo fatto. Allora vi sono i pro e i contro. Il cliente è contento perché viene qui, trova sempre. Io non sono molto contento perché lui viene qui e mi trova, mi fa lavorare. E questo non è bene.
So for those of you who understood that, for the benefit of those who didn't understand that, this was a small business owner who was talking about the challenges of living and working in the same environment, and how there wasn't a clear separation between his life and his family life and his work life. But the benefits he saw were definitely economic. He could save rent. He didn't have to rent a place to work and a place. He could use his family as slave labor. If there was more business, he could move it into the house, or he could, there were a lot of benefits from an economic perspective to this kind of arrangement. But I'll end with all things changed, and as I mentioned before, a lot of the romantic notions I had about this idea of how people could work, the reality of Northern Italy is it's really globalized, and there are shopping malls, and people buy stuff from Taiwan and all over the world, and the industrial fabric really was at that point kind of dying out. There's supposed to be some music. Oh well. There we go. This was filmed on VHS. 8, not even Super 8, I don't think. Okay. Just take a breath. Go back to the It's not working. It's all right.
Okay.
Just go back to the show. Okay. So when I got back, I did some reflecting on this, and these are just three. I've got 3 neighborhoods that I was looking at and analyzing, and this was the neighborhood that had sort of started the whole idea of supporting this network of small landowners and business owners in a very mixed use. There were no controls on zoning. You could live and work. You could do whatever you needed to do. This was in the 50s and 60s. So it was all about kind of pushing the economic side of things and less about any quality of place issues that we tend to focus on a lot more these days. By the 70s, the city and the CNA, which was a union of craft artisans, were really thinking in a very comprehensive way about urban planning, about transportation, about urban design, about building typologies, and about the social and kind of cultural propping up that these small businesses needed in order to succeed. So this neighborhood was one of several neighborhoods where it was much more planned, and there's deliberate ideas about the division or the separation of service and residential streets within the district. And then finally, by the 80s and 90s, they realized that people wanted to live in more suburban areas or in solely residential areas. So they were these industrial districts were still, there were big floor plates, but they had lots of little companies within one kind of shed building. So just a couple images from that first neighborhood, the Modanina neighborhood, where things were very chaotic. Was very tight, urban, and mixed up with shop doors and residential doors without, with no sidewalks or streets or anything like that. But there was also this sort of interesting set of little live-work typologies that were being played with at the time. This is one of them. This was the one that I had seen at the Widener, which was basically those front little buildings are the houses where the people live, and then they have access to the shops behind. That middle street is a residential street, and the service areas, the service streets are accessed behind. So there's heavy service conditions, but also this attempt to make a kind of a nice neighborhood street. And then finally, that kind of the current, or at the time, the current model was to build these kind of suburban, looks familiar, doesn't it? Kind of collections of little businesses in one big cheap shed building. And of course I did a few little sketches, not nearly as nice as Bill's. Just trying to understand the dimensions and how these things were working. In Taipei as well. That the shop house is a very well-known building type, but really getting to see how it functioned and how messy and challenging it was as an urban condition. So I'll just wrap this up with a little bit of when I say that this grant has had an amazing kind of lasting effect for me, what I'm seeing now, what we're all seeing now, is the emergence of a lot of these notions about network-based economies, about the reemergence of manufacturing. I read it in the news. You open the Boston Globe every weekend. The last couple weekends, there's all this talk about what about 21st century manufacturing and how do we support and nurture that and align our economic strategies and educational strategies towards that. We see on the internet these companies that are open source companies where you actually participate in the design of a car, and if they get enough orders from one place in the country, they go in, move in and build a little micro factory, and you participate in the construction of the car. So it's like a totally different idea about how you make a car. These co-working spaces are just like popping up everywhere now. It's like a plague. And as are these maker spaces, these neighborhood-based, district-based facilities where people who want to make stuff can go and rent out machines and participate in, explore things and just do it down the street. Even press a button on their computer and send the file to the computer-operated equipment within a makerspace. And then finally, David Gamble and I just finished this, got this article published. This idea of the innovation district is kind of everywhere. I just got back from Austin where they're talking about how to build an innovation district. And so what I think the point is, I'm so grateful for that opportunity to go off and explore these issues, and they're still relevant, at least for me, in my work today. Thank you.
So just wanted to thank Bill, Frank, and Jan for sharing with us all these wonderful travels and thoughts that emerged from that.